Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. All right, so we've been talking recently about just the lore and how that is either popular or unpopular, and the different themes that would make it just popular or unpopular in our world today. So just kind of like keep going off of that and thinking about epic fantasy. And basically, like, in what ways does like Rings of Power follow like the genre and whatnot? Mark.
Yeah, I think when we think of epic fantasy, there's maybe like a lot of things that come to mind, but generally you think of like magic, fantastic creatures, and like sort of the way the story is structured with like a heavy emphasis on foreshadowing and maybe some clear battle lines in terms of good and evil. I think we see some of the ways, like the question I had was like, what ways does like Rings of Power like follow the genre? And so I had like a few ideas I thought of, like, there are some magical creatures. There's like clearly hobbits and dwarves and stuff like that. You have the Balrog. Aren't there some wolves that attack the hobbits at some point as well that the stranger
Yeah,
saves them from?
yeah. There's like there are wolves at the like the prison break, right?
Yeah, or
A
wargs.
warg, that's
Warg.
right.
Yeah, there's the
Yeah,
one that
wargs at the
looks like
prison
a
break.
pug warg.
Yeah, and then there's like also some magic in the show as well. I had like the stranger and the white clad ladies, as well as like Mithril. Do you guys remember any other magic that was in the show?
There was like the reflection off the water,
That's true.
but
Sauron
that
has some magic. Yeah,
so
that's
but they
Yeah,
didn't really
that's
give him and Galadriel a whole
well.
lot of stuff.
It's because Tolkien himself, like, if you actually go through and read the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and all those things, like, magic is super vague in Tolkien's works. Like, it's not. I think it's good that you're calling this epic fantasy rather than high fantasy because, like, Tolkien's magic system is like super undefined, and like I think the closest you get to actual like spells being cast are in The Hobbit, where Gandalf is like lighting the pine cones on fire. Like everything else is really like vague and undefined and like magical effects and feelings rather than like I cast fireball. Um, and so it's like a lot more focus on like artifacts and magical swords and things like that. So I will say that I think in the show they did a good job at like limiting the magic system to sort of being like undefined and vague, but to a decent level where it's just like magic is definitely in the setting. It's just not real specific.
Yeah, this ties into my like next question is like what does the show do like differently than typical epic fantasy. But I think it's really interesting. Actually, the closest that Tolkien comes to actual spells is in the Fellowship of the Ring in the Mines of Moria, when the Balrog and Gandalf are fighting.
That's
Before
true.
Gandalf seals the door with a specific spell, and the Balrog casts a counter spell. But I think actually it's
Gosh
something like
darn
if you
counter
read
spells.
Tolkien's works again, I know, right? But whenever you read like Tolkien's works again, magic, like you said, is completely undefined. There's no like magic spells like there is in say like Harry Potter or something. But it's
Yeah.
actually like really present in the world.
Oh yeah.
It's like whenever the dwarves are like in passing through, like there's always like they have magical items, they have magical toys. Even Gandalf has like magical fireworks. The elves like their lands are protected by magic, right?
Yeah.
And while it's not like the way it's portrayed in like I said, Harry Potter is the easiest example. It is really present in the world in a way that I didn't really feel like it was in Rings of Power, where it was like, hey, like the elves are in dwarves. Like we saw a lot of elves and dwarves, and like very like little magic at all with those people. And that didn't really seem like it was a good adaptation of some of Tolkien's work. And I was sort of thinking what you guys thought about that.
Okay. I don't know. I think personally I felt like some of the things that weren't explicitly magic. I just sort of chalked up to magic, like the trees in the elven place, all
Mhm.
being lined up. I kind of associated as just like elven wood magic stuff, and then the creation of Mordor as the big sort of magical set piece of we're gonna blow up this entire country and turn it into the Deadlands.
It definitely seems that like there are only like particular characters who can do anything magical. Thinking about like sure, I think like Galadriel probably could have been given like more magical things. I mean, like if you think about it more, you don't really think of her as like carrying a sword as much.
Yeah,
But even if she does carry a sword, it kind of makes sense. All right, like anybody who knows anything, even just about like the movies, knows that like she is very magical, right?
She has some of the most magic in the books. Yeah.
Yeah. So
some of, if not the most magic in the books.
Right. She like casts a spell one time that like sends a mist over to hide the approach during a previous like battle and
I
stuff like
believe
that. She
is that
throws down the
the
walls.
yeah
That was like the first Rohirrim.
yeah.
Yeah.
And she does swim for multiple days at a time, which that could be magical.
Yeah. I was gonna say that like even if you like think of like Lord of the Rings movies, they always make Legolas seem sort of mystical. You know, he's walking on top of the snow, or he's not sleeping at night and notices Sauron is approaching and stuff like that. And I think there's like the sense in Tolkien's work that like, yeah, even if like the dwarves and elves don't have a lot of explicit magic, there's always this sort of like implicit magic that I felt was sort of lacking in
Yeah.
Rings of Power.
Yeah. But that's what the chanting and choir music was for. That's the implicit magic.
the sea is always right.
The sea is
Yeah.
that's the men. They're not supposed to be magical.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
But those are the magic men.
The other theme that I had like that was seemed very different than epic fantasy was this idea of like in epic fantasy as a genre, there's like a ton of foreshadowing, and like Tolkien does this all the time in his works. So like if you think about like Gollum betraying Frodo and Sam, right? There's like this whole scene where it's spelled out explicitly that he's gonna send them to her. You don't know who her is yet, but you know that like he's sending them a trap, right? They don't just show up at a cave and he's like, "What's going on here?" and stuff, right? And like there's entire scenes setting up, say like the charge of the Rohirrim. But like things aren't there to surprise the audience or the reader. They're there to like build the tension and like the presence of the what's coming next in anticipation.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to me that like Rings of Power, and this is like something I don't even know if it works or not, but they seem to like intentionally have flipped this. They kept the audience guessing the whole time on like who the stranger was, who is Sauron and stuff. And like
Yeah.
I think especially I noticed it a lot in say the two of the battle scenes where like both in the Southlands, but like first, Arondir does like all these like cool flips and like brings the tower down, and it's like this cool reveal that like somehow all the people escaped and like are in the village now, rather than like they're not in the tower anymore. Or then at the end, like, oh, we totally forgot that the Numenorians were there, but they suddenly come in at the end and save the day. And it was like, if you think about the Lord of the Rings movies, even though this is like in the books as well, like the Rohirrim coming to save them at Helm's Deep, that's built up for like tons of episodes. Like this is like clearly built up, foreshadowed by like the light coming in, and you hear Gandalf's voice, right? Like, look at my coming. I'll look to the third day, and like you're always like expecting what's coming next, and nothing is like really a surprise. And if anything, this like builds your anticipation for the next part of the story.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to like catch you by surprise. And it was interesting talking, like listening to some of the creators of the show, but they were talking about like specifically the Halbrand reveal. Like, hey, everyone, if we just had him show up as typically as the Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and like clearly everyone would know that this is Sauron, so we need to be more sneaky about it to surprise our audience. And it was like this clear choice that they want to surprise people. And it was like, it didn't really seem like it fit with like the epic fantasy genre to me. And I wanted to hear your guys' thoughts of like, do you guys like this change, or do you not see the change? What?
Yeah. I would say that I think it's because those are the tropes that are popular in fantasy stories right now. Largely, it's easy to blame everything on Game of Thrones, but it was such a major it's such a major force in pop culture until it suddenly wasn't. But I think it did affect a lot of those. You can also look to things like Marvel and Star Wars, where like everybody these days wants to subvert your expectations, and I think. I mean, you could go into all sorts of reasons. You could say it's because with the advent of like the internet and mass media, it's like suddenly we're getting inundated with stories, and so you need a story to subvert your expectations to stand out, supposedly. But I don't think it works with Tolkien because, like you said, it's epic fantasy. It's written in the traditions of the old Norse epics and the old sagas and the olding like Beowulf and the Ring Cycle and the poetic and prose eddas. It's written in that style where basically the outcome is known from the beginning. It's just an epic story of how you get there. And when you go back and look at these things, like, these heroes don't have flaws. Like, Beowulf doesn't have flaws. He goes and beats up everything he sees. Even his death is cool because he dies fighting a dragon, which he kills. So, Tolkien's stories do not trade in the same storytelling tropes that modern stories do. Like, in a certain way, the characters in Tolkien, and this is in no way a criticism, aren't realistic to the extent where, like, they are in a lot of cases more similar to the epic heroes than they are to, you know, Jon Snow or, you know, Captain America or something like that. And so, yeah, it is epic fantasy, where the point of the story is not, oh boy, I really want to know what this character does. It's, let's talk about somebody doing an epic deed. And I think that the showrunners, you know, either the showrunners didn't get it, or the network didn't get it, because they weren't really wanting to make a Lord of the Rings show. They wanted to make a modern fantasy show set in the Lord of the Rings universe.
That was great. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I think, yeah, I just, like, the one thing is that you think of, like, a lot of jump scares, like, maybe you guys have not been watching. I've been watching some of The Mandalorian lately, but you can see there's a lot of, like, other things, but, like, random scary monsters jumping out of nowhere is, like, something that happens, like, a lot, and, like, not just that, but in a lot of shows. Yeah. And, like, you think of, like, I don't know, I think of, like, the Mines of Moria, right, where you, like, you hear the drums in the deep, and as they're coming up, right, rather than just, like, a goblin, like, pops out of nowhere, right, or something like that, or, like, the Balrog surprises them around the corner. It's always, like, this idea of, like, building tension, and, yeah, like you said, it's not something that's popular these days. We all like to have our expectations subverted, but, like, Tolkien builds expectations rather than subverting them.
Yeah, or at least they think we want our expectations subverted, or we think we want our expectations subverted. Whereas I think that the danger of having so much media saturation is that you go through cycles very quickly, where, like, that style of storytelling has gotten stale in about 10 years, because now we're all expecting to have our expectations subverted. And again, not to drag it back to Game of Thrones, but there's a reason why the last season was so disappointing. Is because, and again, I haven't seen the show, but I followed what happened a lot, and I've watched a lot of videos because I do research on shows rather than watching them. But there were all these storylines, like Jaime Lannister had, like, he was set up for a great redemption arc, but then they didn't do it because that was the unexpected thing. And instead of being like, oh wow, they subverted my expectations, everyone was like, wow, that was incredibly disappointing and sad. And I think that's why it's dangerous to lean on subversion of expectation, because oftentimes when you take away the shock value of a subversion of expectation, you just leave people disappointed that what they thought was going to happen didn't happen. So, people like figuring things out before they happen.
Yeah, it's really interesting that people enjoy stories when they know the ending better. Like that was like
Yeah.
I was watching some writing tips recently, and that was one of the famous author's suggestions. Is that people really don't like not knowing what the ending is going to be like. They like to have guessed it beforehand.
Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. Consider supporting my movement on Facebook, keeping the Rings of Power pure.